My neighbor comes to me at night and I'm sick of it. I'm a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer who works from home most of the time. My life is pretty simple. A quiet neighborhood, long hours at the computer, and a few friendly conversations with my neighbors from time to time. At least, it was quiet until 2 months ago when a new neighbor moved in next door. It all started a few weeks after he moved in. His name is Cecil, an elderly man in his late 50s with a perpetually tired expression and a wardrobe that seems to be stuck in the 1980s. He is polite enough during the day, nodding slightly when we pass him on the street, but not very talkative. At first, I didn't think much of him. People come and go in the neighborhood. I just thought he was another quiet soul who wanted to be left alone. The first time I noticed something was wrong with him was about 3 weeks ago. I was working late on a project, and at about 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on my porch. My home office is in the front of the house, so the sound was impossible to miss. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some animal scurrying around, but when I looked out through the blinds, I saw a figure standing on the porch. Cecil. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking at my front door. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, but another part of me thought that maybe he was just confused or looking for something. After about 5 minutes, he turned around and walked back to his house. I chalked it up to him being a little weird and went back to work. The next night, the same thing happened. This time, he tried the doorknob. I watched him turn it, and then he knocked softly. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, hoping he would leave. And he did, eventually. I told myself that it was nothing, maybe some kind of misunderstanding, and decided not to think about it. But it kept happening again. Every night, at about the same time, Cecil would come to my porch. Sometimes he just stood there. Sometimes he knocked or tried to open the door. Once I even heard him muttering something, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was always the same. He would stay for a few minutes and then disappear into the darkness. I started to feel paranoid. During the day, Cecil acted as if nothing had happened. He nodded or waved when we passed each other, as if he hadn't been sneaking up on my house at night. I even thought about talking to him about it. But how do you start a conversation like that? Hey, why do you keep trying to break into my house at 2 in the morning? That didn't seem like a good idea. Instead, I decided to install a camera on the porch. I thought that if I had a recording, I would at least have evidence if the situation escalated. The first few nights of footage showed exactly what I saw. Cecil was standing on my porch, trying to open the door and mumbling. But one night he did something different. He leaned over and looked directly into the camera, a strange, almost knowing smile on his face. Then he whispered something I couldn't hear and walked away. That was the turning point. I called the police and showed them the video. They sent someone to talk to Cecil, but he denied everything. He said he had never been on my porch and that it must have been someone else. The police officer told me that they could do nothing without more evidence or without him actually committing the crime. Frustrated, I decided to confront Cecil in person. The next day, I caught him walking to his car. "Hello, Cecil," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you ever walk around the neighborhood at night?" He looked at me with this tired expression and shook his head. "Number Y?" I hesitated. "Well, someone has been on my porch the last few nights. I just thought maybe it was you." His face didn't change. "It wasn't me," he said simply, then got in his car and drove away. That night I didn't sleep, determined to catch him red-handed. Around 2 a.m., like clockwork, I heard footsteps, but this time I didn't hide. I opened the door just as he reached for the doorknob. "Cecil, what the hell are you doing?" I asked. He did not answer. Instead, he turned around and walked back into his house without saying a word. I was left standing there, furious and confused. The next morning, I saw him in the driveway and decided to press the issue. "Cecil, why do you come to my house every night? What's going on?" He hesitated and then sighed. "I've been sleepwalking my whole life. Stress makes it worse, and moving here hasn't been easy for me. I guess I ended up on your porch without realizing it. I am very sorry." I saw the sincerity in his eyes, and suddenly everything clicked. The blank stare, the mumbling, and even the strange smile at the camera all made sense. Cecil wasn't trying to scare me. He genuinely didn't know what he was doing. After this conversation, Cecil started taking steps to control his sleepwalking, such as locking his door at night and seeing a doctor. He hasn't shown up on my porch again, and although I keep cameras and extra locks, I feel much less uneasy now. Cecil is just a man dealing with something out of his control, and I can't blame him for that. The neighbors are feeling normal again, and to be honest, I'm glad we diffused the situation. Sometimes the scariest situations have the simplest explanations. I found out my neighbor's terrible secret, and now I'm in danger. I don't usually post on Reddit, but I've been losing sleep over something that happened recently, and I need to get it off my chest. This is the kind of thing you see in movies or hear about on true crime podcasts. Not something you ever expect to happen in real life, let alone to you. But here I am. For context, I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. You know, the kind where people wave at each other while mowing their lawns and leave cookies on your porch during the holidays. I moved here 3 years ago, thinking it would be a great place to settle down, and up until last month, I would have said I made the right choice. Things started to change when the house next door went up for sale. It'd been vacant for about a year, and everyone was curious about who the new owners would be. When the moving truck finally pulled up, I did what any good neighbor would do. I walked over to introduce myself. The man who answered the door was off. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with thinning hair and glasses that caught the sunlight in a way that made his eyes seem hidden. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hi there," I said, holding out my hand. "I'm Mike. Welcome to the neighborhood." He shook my hand briefly and said, "Thanks. I'm Dan." That was it. No small talk, no questions about the area, nothing. Just a curt nod before he stepped back inside and shut the door. It was weird, but I figured maybe he was just the quiet type. Everyone's different, right? At first, I didn't think much of him. Dan kept to himself. He didn't have visitors, and the curtains on his windows were always drawn. He'd leave early in the morning and come back late at night. The only sign of life was the occasional sound of tools clinking in his garage. I figured he was working on some kind of project, but again, I didn't pry. People value their privacy, and I respect that. Then one night, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd been tossing and turning, unable to sleep. My bedroom faces Dan's house, and when I glanced out the window, I saw a faint glow coming from his garage. The light flickered, like it was coming from a single bulb swinging back and forth. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a whimper. At first I thought it was an animal, but the more I listened, the more it sounded human. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, careful to stay in the shadows. As I got closer to Dan's house, the sound grew louder, more desperate. I crouched behind a bush near his driveway, trying to see through the small window on the side of the garage. What I saw made my stomach turn. Dan was standing over a workbench, his back to me. On the bench was a large tarp, and something underneath it was moving, struggling. I couldn't make out what it was, but the way it writhed sent a jolt of fear through me. Dan raised his hand, and I saw the glint of a knife. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering against the pavement. The noise must have startled him because the garage light went out instantly. My heart was pounding as I scrambled to pick up the flashlight and sprinted back to my house, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I debated calling the police, but what could I say? "Hi, I think my neighbor might be doing something sketchy in his garage." It sounded ridiculous, and without solid proof, I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. So, I decided to keep an eye on him. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange behavior. Dan's trash cans were always full of heavy-duty black bags, even though I never saw him bring groceries or anything else into the house. One evening, I saw him dragging one of those bags to his car. He looked around nervously before tossing it into the trunk and driving off. I tried to follow him, but I lost him at a red light. My breaking point came 2 weeks later. I was walking my dog late at night when I saw Dan digging in his backyard. The hole was deep, and he was working fast, sweating despite the cool air. My dog started barking, and Dan froze, his head snapping toward me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he smiled that same cold smile from the first day we met and said, "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" I managed a weak laugh and hurried back inside, my hands shaking. That night, I called the police. I told them everything. The sounds from the garage, the bags, the digging. They said they'd send someone to check it out. But when the officers arrived, Dan was calm and cooperative. He let them search the property and even opened his garage. There was nothing there. No tarp, no knife, nothing. Just a half-finished woodworking project. They left, and I felt like an idiot. But I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one. A few days later, one of my other neighbors mentioned hearing strange noises coming from Dan's house at night. We started talking, comparing notes, and the picture became clearer. Something was very wrong with Dan. The last straw came when a missing persons report popped up on the local news. A woman in her 30s had vanished a month ago, right around the time Dan moved in. Her car had been found abandoned less than 5 miles from our neighborhood. The pit in my stomach returned with a vengeance. I don't know what's going on with Dan, but I've reported everything I've seen to the police. They're looking into it, but so far there's no concrete evidence. I'm sharing this here because I can't keep it to myself anymore. If anything happens to me, at least you'll know why. Be careful who you trust, even in a friendly neighborhood like mine. You never really know what's going on behind closed doors. My neighbor was acting strangely, so I called the police. As it turned out, I was right. I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood about 6 months ago. It seemed like the perfect place to settle after a messy breakup, a fresh start in a small house with a modest yard and friendly neighbors. At least that's what I thought. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, redecorating, and occasionally waving at neighbors as I walked my dog, Max. Everyone seemed polite but distant, which suited me fine. I've always been an introvert, so the idea of minimal interaction felt like a bonus. Then, about 2 months in, I noticed someone moving into the house next door. It had been empty since I arrived, so I'd assumed it was abandoned or awaiting sale. From my living room window, I saw a man unloading boxes from a rusty old pickup truck. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a wiry build and a face that seemed perpetually set in a scowl. Something about him felt off, but I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, I'd been hoping for someone quiet, and this guy didn't seem the chatty type. We didn't speak until a few days later, when I ran into him while taking Max for a walk. He was sitting on his front porch, smoking a cigarette and staring into the distance. As I passed, he glanced at me and nodded. "Hey," he said in a gravelly voice. "Hi," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm Lauren. Just moved in a couple of months ago. Rick, he said curtly. Then, without another word, he went back to staring at the street. The interaction left me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Over the next few weeks, Rick's presence became harder to ignore. He had a habit of standing in his front yard at odd hours, sometimes staring at my house. At first, I thought he might just be a quirky guy with insomnia, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable it made me. Once I came home late from work and saw him standing there, illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. He didn't wave or say anything, just stood there, watching as I hurried inside. Over the next few weeks, Rick's presence became harder to ignore. He had a habit of standing in his front yard at odd hours, sometimes staring at my house. At first, I thought he might just be a quirky guy with insomnia, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable it made me. Once I came home late from work and saw him standing there, illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. He didn't wave or say anything, just stood there, watching as I hurried inside. Over the next few weeks, Rick's presence became harder to ignore. He had a habit of standing in his front yard at odd hours, sometimes staring at my house. At first, I thought he might just be a quirky guy with insomnia, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable it made me. Once I came home late from work and saw him standing there, illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. He didn't wave or say anything, just stood there, watching as I hurried inside. Things escalated after that. One evening while I was watching TV, I heard a loud crash outside. I rushed to the window and saw Rick standing in his driveway, staring at something on the ground. It was one of my garden gnomes, smashed to pieces. When he noticed me watching, he smirked and walked back inside. I'd had enough. The next morning, I confronted him. "Rick," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what your problem is, but this needs to stop. You're scaring me." He stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You don't belong here," he said. His voice was calm but chilling. "You should leave." I'd never been more terrified in my life. I hurried back inside and locked every door and window. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, clutching a baseball bat and jumping at every creak and groan the house made. At some point I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of Max barking furiously. I grabbed the bat and ran to the living room where I found him standing at the window, his teeth bared. Outside, Rick was standing on my lawn, staring directly at me. I called the police. When they arrived, Rick was gone, but they found footprints in the mud outside my window. The officers suggested I get security cameras, which I did the very next day. For a while, things were quiet. Rick stayed out of sight, and I started to feel a bit safer. But then, one night, I got an alert on my phone from the security camera. When I checked the footage, my blood ran cold. Rick was standing at my back door, holding something in his hand. It looked like a knife. I called the police again, and this time, they arrested him. But the story doesn't end there. A few days later, I was cleaning out my basement when I found something tucked behind the water heater, a small box filled with old photographs. They were of me, taken through my windows, in my yard, even from the bathroom. The police are still investigating, but I've decided to move. I can't stay here, knowing what's happened. The scariest part? I'll never know how long Rick had been watching me, or what might have happened if I hadn't installed those cameras. All I can do now is leave, and hope that I've escaped whatever nightmare I stumbled into. If you like these stories, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Thank you for watching.